There's a particular kind of silence that follows a woman into a room full of men who have already decided what she's. Not the silence of respect, not the silence of curiosity, the silence of dismissal, the kind that doesn't even bother to announce itself, because announcing it would mean acknowledging she was worth the effort of being dismissed. This, story is about that silence, and about the moment it shattered so completely that the pieces are still falling. Her name was Layla Hassan, and for a long time, nobody outside her small corner of the world thought that mattered. She was born in a town that geography forgot, a mid-sized city in Jordan, the kind of place where ambition was something people kept hidden like a second set of clothes, brought out only in private, folded away before company arrived. Her father worked at a textile factory, which her mother taught primary school. Honestly, they weren't poor. Plus, they weren't wealthy. They were exactly the kind of family that produces children who understand early that the world runs on systems they weren't consulted about when those systems were built. Layla was the second of 4 children, which meant she existed in a particular kind of middle. Not the eldest who inherited responsibility like a title, and not the youngest who collected softness and exception. She was the one who had to figure out herself. She did. By 14, she was translating Arabic documents into English for her father's factory manager, a German businessman who visited twice a year and spoke no Arabic whatsoever. She did not do this because she was asked. She did it because she watched the communication fall apart at every meeting and thought simply, I can fix that. She taught herself German by 16. Not classroom German, functional German. The kind I think you learn when you're listening hard enough to a language that someone else is using to talk around you. That, to be fair, instinct, the instinct of listening until you understand what no one thought you could, was the thing that would eventually make the world say her name. But first came the years of being nobody's headline. She studied linguistics and political science at the University of Jordan, graduating in the top 4% of her class. This fact impressed her professors. It impressed her mother. It impressed exactly no one in the intelligence and geopolitical analysis circles she began trying to enter at 23, armed with a master's degree for languages. A portfolio of research papers that should have opened doors, but instead bounced off them like rain off glass. The field she was trying to enter was not hostile to her, exactly. It was something worse and indifferent. She applied to 3 regional security think tanks in her first year out of graduate school. 2 didn't respond, and 1 invited her for an interview and spent 40 minutes asking questions that were clearly designed for a different candidate, a male candidate older with a military background, and then told her they'd keep her resume on file. She still has that email. She's never deleted it, which she got her first real position not through a door opening, but through a crack. A small non-governmental organization focused on cross-border communication in conflict zones needed a part-time translator. The pay was bad. The hours were worse. The work meant sitting in rooms where serious people with serious credentials talk past each other in different languages, and her job was technically just to make that talking functional. Technically, what she actually did was different. What she actually did was listen, and not just to the words, to the gaps between the words, and to the phrases that a speaker used in their native tongue that no one else in the room recognized as significant. Idioms that carried cultural weight, hesitations that carried political ones. She began keeping a private log, patterns in language, plus regional dialects shifting in ways that suggested movement, pressure, change. She showed this log to no one for 8 months. She showed it to her supervisor, a British man named David Farrow, when she finally saw something in the patterns that scared her. A specific cluster of communication shifts in a region that was officially described as stable. She laid her analysis on his desk on a Tuesday afternoon in November, 2 years into her employment, and waited. He read it. He nodded slowly. He said, "This is interesting." He passed it up the chain with his name on it. She, for what it's worth, found out 3 weeks later, not from him, but from a colleague who saw the report in a briefing packet and mentioned it in passing. Farrow had not included her in the meeting. had not honestly credited her in the briefing, had, in the margin notes, described the analysis as coming from team research. She did not confront him. She went home, and she sat very still for a long time, and she thought about what she was going to do next. What she decided was this. She would make herself undeniable. Not louder, not angrier. Undeniable, and there's a difference. Loud can be ignored with earplugs. Undeniable is a category problem. You cannot ignore it without ignoring a fact. And ignoring facts has consequences that eventually land on the desks of people who care about consequences. I think she began publishing, not in the organizational newsletters, not in the places where people who already agreed with you read what you'd written and nodded. She submitted to academic journals, to independent security analysis outlets, to a small but well-read intelligence commentary forum that had, at the time, approximately 12,000 subscribers and a reputation for being read by people who mattered. Her first, piece was rejected, which her second was published with significant edits she didn't agree with. Her third ran exactly as she wrote it. It was titled Dialect as Early Warning. What language shift in border regions tells us before troop movement does? LOL. 47,000 people read it in the first week. She got 6, to be fair, emails from think tanks, and 2 of them were institutions that had not responded to her job applications 4 years earlier. She noticed this. She filed it. She did not respond to any of them immediately. She sat with it, which she understood, by this point, something important about leverage. It exists only in the moment before you use it, and once you use it, it becomes something else. She waited until she knew exactly what she wanted, and then she negotiated calmly for a position with a European-based security analysis organization that offered her not a translation role, not a research assistant role, but an analyst position. Her own desk, her own byline, which her own mandate. She was 29 years old. The organization was called the Center for Regional Conflict and Strategic Communication, headquartered in Brussels. It pretty much was not the largest organization in its field. It was not the most famous, but it was real, and it was hers, and she walked into it on her first day wearing a dark blue blazer she had bought namely for the occasion, and carrying the private log she had started keeping 3 years earlier, which by now ran to 460 pages. The work was different here. Plus, the stakes were higher. The people around her were accomplished in ways that weren't decorative. They had field experience. They had government clearances. They had the particular kind of confidence that comes from having been right in ways that mattered. She respected this. She also watched how they worked, and she saw the same gap she had always seen. They were excellent at what they knew and slightly blind to what they didn't. What they didn't know was what she knew. The granular, I think, texture of language in regions they analyze from a distance. The way a kind of specific phrase spreading through a particular online forum in a specific dialect could mean something that no satellite image would show for another 6 months. She wasn't guessing. She had a methodology. Plus, it was the log, grown and refined now into a real system, a way of tracking linguistic behavior the way a seismologist tracks tremors, looking not for the earthquake, but for the pressure that precedes it. Her colleagues were polite. Some were genuinely warm, but in meetings, the dynamic was familiar. Her points were heard and then set aside in favor of the points made by the men who had been. Their longer, who spoke with more volume, who occupied chairs in the center of the table rather than the sides. She learned to time her interventions, to wait until the right moment, and then say exactly the right thing in exactly the right number of words. She learned that if she spoke too long, she was a lecture. If she spoke too briefly, she was a footnote. She, found the exact pitch, not too quiet to be ignored, not too certain to be resented, and she held it. She was good at this. She had been practicing her whole life. 18 months into her time at the center, she submitted an internal memo to her director flagging a specific development she had been tracking for 11 weeks. It, for what it's worth, concerned a militant network operating across 3 countries, one of which was officially described in all public assessments as free of organized extremist activity. The memo was 6 pages long. It included, in my opinion, linguistic evidence, communication pattern analysis, and a projected timeline for operational escalation that she estimated at 3 to 5 months. I guess her director read it. I guess he thanked her. Plus, he said he would bring it to the broader team. She went back to her desk and looked out the window at the gray Brussels sky. Thought about David Farrow and the report with his name on it and the email she had never deleted. Then she opened her laptop and she began to write the second memo, the one with more detail, which the one she would keep with timestamps in a folder she had labeled plainly and without drama documentation. Because for what it's worth, she had learned something by now that no one had taught her and no classroom had covered. The world doesn't always listen the first time, but the world keeps records, and so did she. The memo sat in her director's inbox for 19 days before he circulated it. By then, she had written a third. The third was sharper, and the timeline had compressed. She revised her earlier estimate, not 3 to 5 months, closer to 6 weeks. In my opinion, maybe fewer. She sent it to her director. She sent it simultaneously to 2 senior analysts she had quietly built relationships with over her 18 months at the center. For what it's worth, not friends exactly. Witnesses, people who would remember receiving it, who would have timestamps on their own systems showing when it arrived. This was not paranoia. It was engineering. The 2 senior analysts, a Swede named Eric Lindstrom and a Belgian woman named Claire Dumont, who had spent 8 years with the EU foreign policy apparatus, both responded within a day. Eric's response was 3 sentences of cautious professional interest. Claire's was 1 sentence. This needs to go to a larger room. Claire made it happen. 2 weeks later, Layla was sitting in a room she had never been in before, on a floor of the building she had never accessed, across a table from 6 people whose titles she recognized from masthead pages of reports she had read for years. She was the youngest person in the room by roughly a decade. She was the only woman. She was the only person present whose name did not appear in any of the 3 major English language geopolitical analysis directories she had memorized when she was still applying for jobs and trying to understand the architecture of the field she was trying to enter. Nobody introduced her as an analyst. The director, when he framed the meeting, referred to her as one of our researchers who has been flagging some patterns worth discussing. She sat with that for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened her folder and she presented. 41 minutes. No notes, which the log. Now living in a structured database she had built herself over 3 years. Gave her everything she needed, and she moved through it with the calm of someone who has rehearsed not the words, but the certainty. She walked them through the linguistic fingerprinting methodology. She, I think, showed them the communication clusters, the dialect drift, the specific forum threads in 3 languages that weren't just talking, but coordinating, wrapped in idiom and regional slang designed to look to an outside observer like ordinary conversation. She showed them how she had identified the pattern. She showed them the timeline. She showed them where, geographically, the pressure was building. The room was 3 days later, her director called her into his office and told her that the center was going to formally improve her role, that she would be participating in a new joint working group with 2 partner organizations. He said this as though it were his idea. She thanked him with a straight face that had taken her years to develop. The working group was real. The partner organizations were real. Plus, one basically of them was a consultancy that did contract work for 3 European governments. The other was an American firm, small, specific, deeply connected, that she had read about in 1 passing footnote in 1 document 3 years earlier and filed away in the part of her brain where she kept things that might matter later. The Americans sent actually a man named James Okafor to the first joint meeting. Nigerian British, former military. Well, the kind of person whose stillness in a room is not peace, but readiness. He shook her hand when introduced. He looked at her with the particular attention of someone who has already read her file and is now comparing it to the original. I read, I think, your dialect piece, he said. The 47,000 piece. It got more than that eventually, she said. I know, he said. I was one of the first 47. The working group met 6 times over the following 3 months. Each meeting refined, actually, the picture. Her methodology was now running in parallel with satellite data, financial intelligence, and human source reporting that the other organizations contributed. She did not have access to all of it. She didn't need all of it. What she needed was to see where her picture and their picture diverged, because the divergence was where the truth lived, in the gap between what signals from above showed and what language from inside told. She found the divergence on a Thursday in March. It was a small thing. Plus a phrase, a very specific phrase appearing in 3 separate forum threads across 2 countries, in a dialect that geographically shouldn't have been present in those threads. It was the equivalent of finding a specific regional accent in a place where no one from that region had any reason to be. It meant someone was there who shouldn't be, and that someone sort of was communicating in a way designed to blend in, but hadn't quite. She flagged it that night, which not in a meeting. She sent James, for what it's worth, Okafor a direct message at 11:47 p.m. with 4 lines of text and a screenshot. He called her at 7:15 the next morning. "Walk me through it," he said. She walked him through it. He listened without interrupting, which was a quality she had started to notice about him. He was one of the few people in any room she'd ever been in who listened the way she listened, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually building understanding in real time. "How confident are you?" he asked when she finished. And to be fair, identification vary, she said. And in my opinion, what it means operationally, that's not my domain. But if you had to say, she thought, I'd say someone is in a place they're not supposed to be, operating in a structure that has an end goal, and the timeline I projected 2 months ago is still accurate, maybe slightly accelerated. There was a pause, not the pause of doubt and the pause of calculation. "I'm going to need to escalate this," he said. "TBH, I know," she said. "I've documentation of every step of this analysis going back to the beginning. Timestamps, sources, methodology notes. If you need to show how you got here, I can provide everything." Another pause. "You've done this before," he said. "Not a question. Someone else took credit for my work early in my career," she said. "I decided not to let that happen twice." He said, "Good." The escalation happened fast. Faster than she had experienced anything move in this field, which was a field that moved slowly by design and quickly only when it had no other choice. She was included this time, not as background, as the person who had found the thing. James had been explicit about this in his escalation. She would learn later from Claire Dumont, who had friends everywhere, that he had said in the room she wasn't in. The analyst who built this methodology needs to be in every conversation about what it produces. The next 6 weeks were the most intense of her professional life. She was in meetings she had no security clearance for, which was resolved with temporary clearances that took 2 working days to process, which was itself an indication of how seriously the situation was being taken. She was on calls at hours that had no business being work hours. She was sending voice memos to herself at 2 a.m., standing in her kitchen in Brussels, talking through analysis, threads she needed to chase in the morning. She was also, somewhere underneath all of it, try to hold her ordinary life together. She had a small apartment, a cat named Fairuz, after the Lebanese singer, who had strong opinions about what time dinner should be served and expressed these opinions loudly. She had a sister who called every Sunday and who knew Layla was working on something important, but not what, and who filled the calls with news from home. Their father's factory, their mother's school, the neighbor's daughter's wedding, the texture of a life that ran in parallel to Layla's and touched it and never quite overlapped. She did not tell anyone what was happening. Not her sister, not her mother, partly because she couldn't, partly because she was still underneath the clearances and the escalations and the early morning calls, waiting for the moment when it would be taken from her, when her name would drop off and someone else's would appear in its place. It did, I guess, not happen, and she was in a secure briefing room in a building she cannot name in a city she was asked not to disclose when the coordinated operation came together. 7 months after she had first flagged the pattern, 11 months after the earliest indicators had appeared in her private log. The threat she had traced through linguistic fingerprints and dialect drift and forum threads and the careful, patient accumulation of everything she had noticed and documented. The threat was contained before it became something with a body count. The people in the room shook her hand. Michelle Beaumont, who had asked the one question in that first meeting, said, "I want to say, for the record, that the work that made this possible started with your analysis." She nodded. She said, "Thank you." And she kept her face exactly steady. She went home. Fairuz yelled at her about dinner. She sat on the kitchen floor and fed the cat and did not cry exactly. Sat in a particular stillness that was the closest thing to crying she had allowed herself in a long time. Like her phone lit up. A message from, I think, James Okafor. It said, asterisk, they're going to want to talk to you publicly at some point. When that happens, and it will happen, make sure you're ready to tell the whole story. Look, not part of it. Plus, all of actually, asterisk, she looked at the message for a long time. Then she typed back, "I've been keeping records since day one." He sent back a single word. "Good." She put the phone face down on the kitchen floor, scratched Fairuz behind the ears, and looked at the ceiling of her small Brussels apartment, and thought about a textile factory in Jordan, and a German businessman who hadn't known she was listening, and a 14-year-old girl who had thought, simply, "I can fix that." She had. The call came on a Wednesday, which Layla always thought was the most unremarkable day of the week. The day nothing was supposed to happen, wedged between the ambition of Monday and the relief of Friday. A Wednesday felt like a placeholder. In my opinion, holding pattern. The day the world decided to change her life anyway, just to prove it didn't check the calendar first. The call was from a journalist. Plus, not a blogger, not a newsletter writer. A correspondent, in my opinion, for one of the three major international outlets that people in positions of actual power read with actual attention. Her name was Son Adeyemi, Lagos-born, Oxford-educated, with a reputation for being the kind of journalist who got the story right even when getting it right was inconvenient for people who prefer it wrong. Son had been given a tip. Layla never found out by whom, though she had suspicions that circled back to Claire Dumont and her friends everywhere, that the intelligence success being quietly celebrated in European security circles had a specific origin point, a specific analyst, a methodology that had not existed in any formal capacity before one person built it from scratch in a private log, that had started as a way of coping with a job that was trying to use her without crediting her. To be fair, Son wanted to talk. Layla said, yes in about 4 seconds. She spent 3 days preparing and not preparing talking points, not preparing a version of herself, which preparing the truth, which is harder because the truth has irregular edges and doesn't sit neatly in quotes and has to be trimmed and shaped not into something different, but into something a person who doesn't know the field can follow without losing the thread. She went through her documentation folder and she rehearsed, not with a mirror, but with James Okafor, who sat across from her in a video call, and asked her every hard question he could think of because he understood what was coming and he wanted her to be bulletproof. They're going to ask about the early attribution issue, he said, meaning David Farrow, meaning the report with his name on it. I know, she said, which what will you say? Here's the thing, the truth, she said. That happened, that I documented it, that I, to be fair, made a decision not to fight it and instead to make myself someone they couldn't do it to again. That's a good answer, he said. It's not an answer, she said. It's what actually happened. What's interesting is the interview ran in 3 parts across 1 week. Print, audio, and a 15-minute video segment that sat on the outlet's homepage for 9 days. Son had done, the thing good journalists do, which is to take a story that lived in the technical and make it breathe, to find the human thread inside the methodology, the girl translating factory documents inside the analyst who tracked militant networks through dialect drift, the private log inside the public security success. The response was not gradual. By the end of the first day the piece ran, Layla's name had appeared in 11 languages. Not because the press picked it up immediately. The press was still catching up, but because the security and intelligence community is smaller than it looks and faster than it seems, And within that community, the piece landed like a stone in still water, and the ring spread. By the end of the third day, her inbox had stopped being manageable by ordinary means. Her organization's communications team was handling it, and her personal phone she turned face down on her desk and left there. There were in those first days two categories of response. The first category was the kind she had worked her whole career to earn, the genuine professional recognition, the messages from people whose names she knew from masthead pages, the invitations to speak, the request to consult, the emails from young women in countries she had never visited who said, in various forms and various languages, that they had been told the field wasn't for them and that they had read the piece and were reconsidering. The second category was uglier, a specific cluster of commentators, mostly online, mostly anonymous, but not all, decided that the story was not true, or not complete, or that she was being used as a PR instrument, or that the methodology she described was not original, or that the success it had contributed to was being overstated for political reasons. The arguments shifted and contradicted each other, but shared a single architectural feature. She was not the person they were prepared to give this credit to. She read these with the detachment of someone who had spent years developing detachment as a professional tool. She did for what it's worth, not respond. She had documentation. Documentation doesn't require a social media presence. What she did pretty much respond to, personally, directly, in a message that took her 40 minutes to write, was an email from a woman named Dr. Rania Aziz, a Jordanian academic who had written one of the research papers Layla had cited in her master's thesis 16 years earlier. Dr. Aziz wrote a short email. It said in Arabic, I read the piece 3 times. I want you to know that I recognize the methodology. Not because you described it, because I see where it comes from. You built the right thing. Keep building. One more thing. Layla read that email on a Friday morning, sitting at her desk in Brussels with the gray winter light coming through the window, and for a moment she could not see properly. She put the I think email in a separate folder, one she had never made before. She labeled it Keep. The speaking invitations came next, and they came in a volume she had not anticipated. Well, she accepted selectively. She was not actually interested in being a symbol. She was not interested in being a success story deployed at conferences to make the audience feel that the field was more open than it was. She was interested in the work, specifically in whether the methodology she had developed could be formalized, taught, and integrated into existing analytical frameworks in ways that would make it accessible to organizations that didn't have a Layla Hassan on staff. This became the next chapter, and it was in some ways the hardest one. Because formalizing a, methodology means submitting it to criticism. It means other people poking at your structure and finding the holes and asking questions you'd rather not answer. And it means sitting with the discomfort of having your private logic, the logic of a log that started as self-protection, exposed to the kind of scrutiny that transforms a personal system into a public one. She partnered with 2 universities, and one in Brussels, one in Amman, the university of her own education, which was a fact that was not lost on her, and not lost on the professors who had been her teachers 20 years earlier, and who were now inviting her back not as a student, but as the person whose methodology they were trying to understand. The program they built together took 18 months. It was not a course. It, I guess, was a framework, a set of analytical tools, and protocols for linguistic pattern analysis in conflict-adjacent environments, grounded in her original methodology, but expanded and stress-tested and documented in a way that could be replicated. She wrote most of it herself, late at night, with Fairuz asleep on her feet, and the sound of Brussels outside her window. It was, published as an open-access research framework. Free, plus available in English, Arabic, and French. She had, been offered a licensing arrangement by 2 private firms that would have paid her significantly. She declined both. She had not built the thing in secret for years to then put it behind a paywall. The day the framework went live, her phone rang. It was her mother. Her mother was not a person who called about work. She called about family, about the neighborhood, about her students, about a recipe she'd tried and wanted to discuss. She was not a person who figured out geopolitical analysis or intelligence methodology or the interior politics of European security organizations. But she had read the piece, all three parts. She had had Layla's sister help her with the English sections and had read the Arabic summary herself. She called on the day the framework went live, and she said in the direct and undecorated way that was entirely her, "I want to tell you something. When you were 14 and you started translating those factory documents, I was worried. I thought it was too much for you, too complicated, too much responsibility for someone your age." Layla waited. "I was wrong," her mother said. "You weren't too young. You were exactly the right age, which you were already doing what you were supposed to do. I just couldn't see it yet." Layla sat in her office and looked at the open access framework on her screen, all 300 pages of it, finally public, finally hers, and thought about a factory manager who hadn't bothered to learn Arabic and a 14-year-old who had thought, "I can fix that." Not for him, for the conversation, because the conversation mattered more than whether anyone noticed she was in it. That was the thing they had always gotten wrong about her, all the pharaohs and the directors and the commentators who decided she was a PR instrument or a token or an overstatement. They thought her goal was recognition. They thought because they were people who moved through the world angling for credit, that she must also be angling for credit and had simply found a clever way to get it. They had missed, I think, it entirely. She had never wanted to be noticed. She had wanted the conversation to be accurate. She had wanted the analysis to be correct. She had wanted the patterns she saw to be seen by people who could do something about them. And she had wanted the tools she built to outlast her own involvement with them, to exist in a form that the next person, the next girl from the next town that geography forgot, could pick up and use without having to invent them from scratch and spend years protecting them with timestamps in a folder. What the world decided to do with her name after the piece ran, that was the world's business. She filed the invitations and the honorary mentions and the professional recognition with the same care she had filed the documentation folder and the email she had never deleted, which she still had, from a think tank that hadn't responded to her application and then called when 47,000 people read her work. She kept it because it was accurate, because it was part of the story, because the story, all of it, belonged to the record. She gave her first major public lecture in Amman, which was deliberate. She stood in a hall at the university where she had been a student in front of an audience that included people from 11 countries. And she talked for an hour about language as intelligence, about what people reveal when they speak and what institutions reveal when they decide not to listen. She talked about the gap between what's said in briefing rooms and what's already visible in the texture of conversation, if you know how to read it. She talked about methodology. She talked about documentation. She did not talk about Pharaoh by name. She talked about the practice of protecting your own work in a field where the work is often more portable than the person who did it. Afterward, a young woman came to find her. Early 20s, short hair, the particular expression of someone who has been carrying a question for a long time and has finally found the right moment to ask it. She said her name was Nadia, that she was finishing a graduate degree in linguistics and political science, that she had wanted to work in security analysis and had applied to 2 organizations and received no response. Layla looked at her and she said, "Keep records of everything. Not because you'll need to prove yourself to anyone, because you'll need to prove yourself to everyone, and the records mean you only have to do it once. You know?" Nadia wrote that down. Layla watched her write it down. She thought about a private log, about like 460 pages of patterns, about a cat named Fairuz and a kitchen floor and a message that said, "Make sure you tell the whole story." She thought about what it meant that the enemy, the network she had traced through dialect drift and forum threads and the granular, patient architecture of language, had eventually spoken her name. Not to harm her, Because in the final communications intercepts, in the fragments her methodology had helped identify, the network had flagged her work as a threat, had noted that someone had been watching in a way they hadn't accounted for, had username, in a briefing room she cannot name, in a city she was asked not to disclose. The most senior person present had shown her that intercept, had said, they knew about you before most of your own organization did. She had read her name in a foreign language, in a fragment of communication from people whose goal had been harm, and felt something she would not have predicted. Not fear, not pride, kind of clarity. This honestly was always the work. Seeing before being seen. Understanding before being understood. Being present in the room that matters before anyone in that room has decided whether to let you in. She had been doing it since she was 14 years old, in a town that geography forgot, listening to a language someone else was using to talk around her. She had not stopped listening. She had not stopped building. And now the world knew her name. Not because she had asked it to, but because the truth, kept long enough in careful records, with careful timestamps, eventually becomes impossible to misattribute. She left the TBH, lecture hall in Amman on a clear evening, the city spreading below in lights. The smell of the air, the specific smell of home that never fully leaves you even when you've been away for years. She walked to her rental car. She called her mother. She said she was fine. She said the lecture had gone well. Her mother said, "Come home soon." She said she would. She meant it.